Knowing. Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. We're going to be doing a couple of short stories tonight. We started and finished Through the Looking Glass last week, and that was really fun. And then I realized, oh, it's October. I should do something spooky. And then I learned my lesson from last time I tried to do a spooky book. Because last time I did a spooky book, it ran out of October and it drove me nuts the whole time. So I'm doing short stories because they don't take up as much time. So we've got a few lined up here. Cask of Amontillado is up first. The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. Let's dive right in. The thousand injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to any threats. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled. But the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes the redresser, is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor by deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato. Although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have that true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and the opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires, in painting and in gemmery. Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack, but in the matter of old wines he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skilful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he'd been drinking much. The man wore a motley dress. He had on a tight-fitting, party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by a conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. Conical cap and bells, you picture the typical jester hat, the little pointy jingle, jingle, jingle. And, party-striped dress, probably. That same sort of jester-esque vibe. And he's been drinking much, so he's very flushed, that sort of thing. Anyway, I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you're luckily met. How remarkably well you're looking today. I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts. I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found. I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado?" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado?" "I must satisfy them." "Amontillado?" "Oh, as you're engaged, I'm on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it's he. He will tell me, Lucchesi can't tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Oh, come, let us go." "Whither?" "To your vaults." "Oh, my friend, no, I won't impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement at Lucchesi, you see." "I have no engagement. Come along." "My friend, no. It's not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you're afflicted. Oh, the vaults are insufferably damp. They're encrusted with nitre." Nitra being, probably if not the literal mineral nitra, it may actually be, a sort of mold. These are very damp catacombs in which he's speaking, in which this wine is held. Actually, let's look that up Because I'm picturing like lime buildup almost. Nitra. Or niter, probably. Another term for potassium nitrate. Encrusted with the potassium nitrate, it's soft, white, highly soluble mineral. So, my picturing of, oh, there's a bunch of lime deposits on these walls are not far off. Potassium nitrate. So it'd be niter. Anyway, let us go. Let us go. Nevertheless, the cold's merely nothing, Amontillado. You've been imposed upon. As for Lucchesi, he cannot distinguish the sherry from the Amontillado. Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm, putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a requelaire closely about my person. I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from them their sconces. I took from their two sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led down into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. If I can click the pages correctly. The Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. The pipe. It's further on, but observe the white web-work which gleams from the cavern walls. He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. Niter? Niter, yes. How long have you had that cough? My poor friend had found it impossible to reply for many minutes. Oh, it's nothing. Come, I said with decision. We'll go back. Your health is precious. You're rich, respected, admired, beloved. You're happy as once I was. You're a man to be missed. Oh, Library's gotten a little bit of the niter in his nose too, haven't you, buddy? Where was I? You're a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We'll go back. You'll be ill. I cannot be responsible. Besides, there's Lucchesi. Enough. The cough is a mere nothing. It won't kill me. I shall not die of this cough. Oh, true, true. Indeed, I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily. You should use all your proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps. And here I knocked off the neck of a bottle, which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mould. Drink this, said I, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly while his bells jingled. I drink to the buried that repose all around us. And I to your long life. He again took my arm, and we proceeded. These vaults are extensive. Oh, the Montresors, they were a great and numerous family. I forget your arms. A huge human foot d'or in the field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant, whose fangs are embedded in the heel. And the motto? Nemo me impune lacessit. I excuse my Latin. The closest I have to a good pronunciation of Latin is ecclesiastical from various musical things. So you'll excuse me if it's poorly pronounced. Let's translate that, actually. If I can open my cellular tellular. It's never it's something. Nemo me impune lacessit. No one attacks me with impunity. Yes. That is something along the line that I was thinking, but I wanted to make that clear. in case you're not big on Latin. Neither am I, to be fair. I should learn more of it. Useful thing. Anyway, good. The wine sparkled in his eyes, and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. We had passed through walls of piled bones, with casks and puncheons intermingling, into the innermost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. The nitre, see, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We're below the riverbed. The drops of moisture, they trickle among the bones. Come along. We'll go back before it's too late. Your cough. It's nothing. Let us go on. Another draught of the Medoc first. I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light and laughed, as he threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I do not understand. I looked at him surprised, and he repeated the movement. It was a grotesque one. You do not comprehend? Not I. Then you're not of the Brotherhood. How? You're not of the Masons. Yes. You? Impossible. A Mason? Mason. A sign. It is this, I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my roquelaire. Oh, you jest, he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. Let us proceed to the Amontillado. Oh, be it so, said I, replacing the tool beneath the cloak, and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descended again, arriving at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeaux rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another, less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of a great catacomb in Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. The 4th side, however, the bones, they'd been thrown down, and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall, thus exposed by the displacing of these bones, we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet in width, 3 in height, and 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use, but within itself, formed merely an interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination, the feeble light, did not enable us to see. Proceed. Here ends the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi— No, he's an ignoramus, interrupted my friend as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, and from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was much too astonished to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. Pass your hand over the wall. You can't help feeling nitre. Indeed, it's very damp. Once more, I must implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you. First, I'll render you all the little attention in my power. The Amontillado! Ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from the astonishment. Ah, true, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones, of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry, when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had, in a great measure, worn off, unlike this one's interest in my phone cable. You don't get to eat the phone cable. I know I shouldn't have bought the phone cables that look like string, and that's why. but you don't get to eat the phone cable. It will not taste good. It will point. It will stab at you, kitty. That's how it works. Here, how's about we lay down?
No, you sat up. No fun.
Anyway, I had in great measure worn off. That's where I was. The earliest indication I had of this was a low groaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and then the third, the fourth. Then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with more satisfaction, I ceased my labours and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interruption the fifth, sixth, and seventh tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my chest. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated, trembling. I unsheathed my rapier and began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs, and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall, and replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed, I aided, I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, 9th, and 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position, but now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We'll have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo over our wine." The Amontillado. Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo? Lady Fortunato, the rest. Let us be gone. Yes, let us be gone. For the love of God, Montresor! Yes, for the love of God. To these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer, and so I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in reply only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. Forcing the last stone into its position, I plastered it up, and against the new masonry I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requias. Requiescat in pace. In pace requiat. Oh man, I fumbled the last three words of that? Really? Oh, that's awful. I can't believe I fumbled the last line. No. Pain, agony even. Oh man. So if you can't tell, I do have quite the fondness for a good deal of Edgar Allan Poe's work. There's a very specific cadence and style to it all, and he fits very well into this sort of Halloween vibe that we're aiming for. So up next should be, if I can find it here, Ring Once for Death. This one's a little less popular than the other selections this evening. I really should turn off this CSS that immediately tries to fill in. I didn't get it to work. I can get it to work. I should get it to work. But this one's a pull from an old Amazing Stories issue. As the note states, it was reproduced from Amazing Stories, March 1954, and they did a great deal of digging and found that the copyright was not renewed. So I think we are in the clear on this one. This one, I will be honest, I'm assuming is kind of a spooky thing, given the title and the tags I found it with. Oh, yeah, let me get a little more water. Here. Before I start in on Ring Once for Death by Robert Arthur. The power of the old gods was certainly nothing for Mark and Edith, a modern 20th century couple, to worry about. After all, everybody dies. 20 years had left no trace inside Sam Key's little shop on Mott Street. There were the same dusty jars of ginseng root and tiger's whiskers, the same little bronze Buddhas, the same gimcracks, mixed with fine jade. Edith Williams gave a little murmur of pleasure as the door shut behind them.
Mark, it hasn't changed. Doesn't look as if a thing has been sold since we were here on our honeymoon.
Yes, it certainly doesn't, Dr. Mark Williams agreed, moving down the narrow aisle behind her. If someone hadn't told us Sam Key was dead, I believe we stepped back 20 years in time like they do in those scientific stories young David reads.
We must buy something for a 20th anniversary present. Perhaps a bell?
From the shadowy depths of the shop, a young man emerged, American in dress and manner, despite the oriental contours of his face. Good evening. May I show you something? We think we want a bell, but we aren't quite sure. You're Sam Key's son?
Sam Key Jr., my honored father, passed to the halls of his ancestors 5 years ago. I could just say that he died.
His eyes twinkled at this.
But customers like the more flowery mode of speech. They think it's quaint.
I forgot this one does this. This does a lot of like ooh. It kind of thumbs its nose at the whole like ooh mystical guy that's not white. It kind of thumbs its nose at that as it goes on. You'll see. But I am gonna drop a content warning right here before we get too far, as per the little warning text down below. This one kind of is a little dated. It kind of plays with the concept weirdly in its own datedness. You'll see. But this one turns out a little dated. I will be reading it as text is on the page. Just wanted to make that obvious. Anyway,
I think it's just nice and not quaint at all. We're sorry your father's dead. We hope to see him again. 20 years ago, when we were a very broke young couple on a honeymoon, he sold us a wonderful rose crystal necklace for half price.
Oh, I'm sure he still made a profit. His black eyes twinkled again. But if you'd like a bell, here are some small temple bells, camel bells, dinner bells. But even as he spoke, Edith Williams' hand darted to something at the back of the shelf.
A bell carved out of crystal. Rose crystal at that. What could be more perfect? A rose crystal wedding present and a rose crystal anniversary present.
The young man half stretched out his hand. Oh, I don't think you want that. It's broken.
Broken?
Edith Williams rubbed off the dust and held the lovely bell shape of the crystal, the size of a pear, to the light.
It looks perfect to me.
Oh, I mean it's not complete. Something of the American had vanished from the young man. It has no clapper. It will not ring.
Why, that's right.
The clapper's missing.
Oh, we can have another clapper made. That is, if the original can't be found.
The young Chinese shook his head. The bell and the clapper were deliberately separated by my father 20 years ago. He hesitated for a moment and then added, my father was afraid of this bell. Afraid of it? Mark Williams raised his eyebrows, and the other hesitated again. It will probably sound like a story for the tourists, but my father believed it. This bell was supposedly stolen from the temple of a sect of Buddhists somewhere in the mountains of China's interior. Just as many Occidentals believe the Christian Judgment Day will be heralded by the blast on a St. Peter's trumpet, so this small sect is said to believe that when a bell like this one's rung,
bell carved from a single piece of rose crystal, and consecrated by ceremonies lasting 10 years. Any dead within sound of it will rise and live again." "Oh, heavenly!" Edith Williams cried. "No, no pun intended, of course. Mark, think what a help this bell will be in your practice when we make it ring again." To the Chinese, she added, smiling, "I'm just teasing him. My husband is a very fine surgeon." The other man bowed his head. "I must tell you, you will not be able to make it ring. Only the original clapper, carved from the same block of rose crystal, will ring it. This is why my father separated them." Again he hesitated. "I've told you only half of what my father told me. He said that although it defeats death, death cannot be defeated. Robbed of his chosen victim, he takes another in his place. Thus, when the bell was used in the temple of its origin, let us say when a high priest or a chief had died, a slave or servant was placed handy for death to take, when he had been forced to relinquish his grasp on the important one." He smiled and shook his head. "There, a preposterous story. Now, if you wish it, the bell is $10, plus, of course, the sales tax."
"Why, the story alone is worth more," Dr. Williams declared. "I think we'd better have it sent, hadn't we, Edith? It'll be safer in the mail than in our suitcase."
"Sent?"
His wife seemed to come out of some deep feminine meditation.
"Oh, of course. As for it not ringing, I shall make it ring. I know I shall."
"If the story's true," Williams murmured, "I hope not." The package came on a Saturday morning when Mark Williams was catching up on the latest medical publications in his untidy, book-lined study. He heard Edith unwrapping paper in the hall outside. Then she came in with a rose crystal bell in her hands.
"Mark, it's here. Now, to make it ring."
She plumped herself down beside his desk, and he took the bell and reached for a silver pencil. "Oh, just for the sake of curiosity, and not because I believe that delightful sales talk we were given. Let's see if it'll ring when I tap it. It should, you know." He tapped the lip of the bell. A muted thunk was the only response. Then he tried with a coin, a paper knife, and the bottom of the glass. In each instance, the resulting sound was nothing like a bell ringing.
"If you've finished, Mark," Edith said then with feminine tolerance, "let me show you how it's done."
"Gladly," her husband agreed. She took the bell and turned away for a moment. Then she shook the bell vigorously. Clear, sweet, let's try that again. A clear, sweet ringing shivered through the room, so thin and ethereal that small, involuntary shivers crawled up his spine. "Good Lord, how did you do that?" he exclaimed.
"Oh, I just put the clapper back in place with some thread."
The clapper." He struck his forehead with his palm. "Don't tell me. The crystal necklace we bought 20 years ago?"
"Of course."
Her tone was composed.
"As soon as young Sam Key told us about his father separating the clapper and the bell, I remembered the central crystal pendant on my necklace. It is shaped like a bell clapper, and we mentioned it once. I guessed right away we had the missing clapper, but I didn't say so. I wanted to score on you, Mark." She smiled affectionately at him. "And because, I had a queer feeling Sam Key Jr. wouldn't let us have the bell if he guessed we had the clapper."
"I don't think he would." Williams picked up his pipe and rubbed the bowl with his thumb. Yet he didn't really believe that story he told us any more than we do.
"No, but his father did. And if old Sam Key had told it to us, remember how wrinkled and wise he seemed, I do believe we would have believed the story."
"Oh, you're probably right." Dr. Williams rang the bell and waited. The thin, sweet sound seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, then was gone. Nope, nothing happened. Although, of course, that may be because there was no deceased around to respond.
"I'm not sure I feel like joking about the story."
A small frown gathered on Edith's forehead.
"I had planned to use the bell as a dinner bell to tell the story to our guests, but now I'm not so sure."
Frowning, she stared at the bell until the ringing of the telephone in the hall brought her out of her abstraction.
"Oh, sit still, I'll answer it."
She hurried out, and Dr. Williams, turning the rose crystal bell over in his hand, could hear the sudden tension in her voice when she answered. He was on his feet when she re-entered.
"An emergency operation at the hospital. Nice young man. Automobile accident. Fracture of the skull, the Dr. Amos says. He wouldn't have disturbed you, but you're the only brain man in town with Hendrix out on vacation.
Oh, I know. He was already in the hall, reaching for his hat. Man's work is from sun to sun, but a doctor's work is never done, he misquoted.
I'll drive you. You sit back and relax for at least another 10 minutes.
2 hours later, as they drove homeward, the traffic was light, which was fortunate. More than once, Mark, in a frowning abstraction, found himself on the left of the center line and had to pull back into his own lane. He'd lost patience before, certainly, but never without a feeling of personal defeat. Edith said he put too much of himself into every operation. Perhaps he did, but no. There was every reason why the young man should have lived. Yet, just as Mark Williams had felt that he'd been successful, the patient had died. In 20 years of marriage, Edith Williams had learned to read his thoughts at times. Now she put a hand comfortingly on his arm.
Oh, these things happen, darling. You know that. A doctor can only do so much. Some of the job always remains in the hands of nature, and she does play tricks at times.
Yes, confound it, I know it, her husband growled. I resent losing that lad. There was no valid reason for it, unless there was some complication I overlooked. He shook his head, scowling. I ordered an autopsy, but yes, I'm going to do that autopsy myself. I'm going to turn back and do it now. I have to know. He pulled abruptly to the left to swing into a side road and turn. Edith Williams never saw the car that hit them. She heard the frantic blare of a horn and a scream of brakes, and in an instant, and in a frozen instant, realized that there had been someone behind them about to pass. Then the impact came, throwing her forward into the windshield and unconsciousness. Edith Williams opened her eyes. Even before she realized she was lying on the ground and that the figure bending over her was a state trooper, she remembered the crash. Her head hurt, but there was no confusion in her mind. Automatically, even as she tried to sit up, she accepted the fact that there had been a crash. Help had come, and she must have been unconscious for several minutes at least. Hey, lady, take it easy, the trooper protested. You've got a bad bump. You gotta lie still till the ambulance gets here. It'll be along in 5 minutes.
Mark,
Edith said, paying no attention.
my husband. Is he all right?
Now, lady, please. It's being taken care of. You... But she wasn't listening. Holding to his arm, she pulled herself to a sitting position. She saw their car on its side, some yards away. Other cars pulled up around them in a little knot of staring people. Saw them and dismissed them. Her gaze found her husband lying on the ground a few feet away, a coat folded beneath his head. Mark was dead. She'd been a doctor's wife for 20 years. Before that, she was a nurse. She knew death when she saw it. Mark. The word was spoken to herself, but the trooper took it for a question. Yeah, lady, he's dead. He was still breathing when I got here, but he died 2-3 minutes ago. She got to her knees. Her only thought was to reach his side. She scrambled across the few feet of ground to him, still on her knees, and crouched beside him, fumbling for his pulse. There was none. There was nothing. Just a man who had been alive, and now was dead. Behind her, she heard a voice raised. She turned, where a large, disheveled man was standing beside the trooper, talking loudly. Now listen, officer. I'm telling you again, it wasn't my fault. The guy pulled a sharp left right in front of me. Nothing I could do. So when all three of us killed, you can see by the marks of their car it wasn't my fault. Edith Williams closed her mind to that voice. She let Mark's hand lie in her lap as she fumbled in her bag, which was somehow still clutched in her fingers. She groped for a handkerchief to stem the tears which wouldn't be held back, but something was in the way. Something smooth, hard, and cold. She drew it out and heard the thin, sweet tinkle of the crystal bell. She must have dropped it automatically into her bag as they were preparing to leave the house. The hand in her lap moved. She gasped and bent forward as her husband's eyes opened. Mark, darling. Edith, Mark Williams said with an effort. Sorry. Damned careless of me thinking of the hospital. You're alive! You're alive! Oh, darling, lie still. The ambulance will be here any second. Ambulance? I'm all right now. Help me sit up.
But, Mark,
Oh, just a bump on the head. He struggled to sit up, and the state trooper came over. Whoa, buddy, easy, easy. We thought you was gone. Now let's not lose you a second time. His mouth was tight. Hey, I'm sure glad you're all right, the red-faced man said in a rush of words. Oh, well, you had me all upset, even though it wasn't my fault. You know, how's a guy gonna keep to hitting you from when, you know... Catch him! Mark Williams cried, but the trooper was too late. The other man plunged forward to the ground and lay where he had fallen, without quivering. The clock in the hall struck 2 muted strikes. Cautiously, Edith Williams arose on her elbow and looked down at her husband's face. His eyes opened and looked back at her.
you're awake.
Woke up a few minutes ago. I've been lying here thinking.
I'll get you another phenobarbital. Dr. Amos said for you to take them and sleep till tomorrow.
I know. I'll take one presently. You know, hearing that clock just now, it reminded me of something.
Yes?
Just before I came to this afternoon, after the crash, I had a strange impression of hearing a bell ring. Sounded so loud, sounded so loud in my ears, I opened my eyes to see where it was.
A bell?
Yes, just an auditory hallucination, of course.
But, Mark,
Yes?
a bell did ring. I had the crystal bell in my bag. It rang just a little bit. Do you suppose?
Oh, of course not.
But he spoke swiftly.
But though he spoke swiftly, he did not sound convincing. This was a loud bell, like a great gong.
Oh, but I mean, Mark, darling, a moment earlier you had no pulse.
No pulse?
You weren't breathing as such. The crystal bell tinkled and you...
Oh, nonsense. I know what you're thinking. Believe me, it's nonsense.
Mark,
She spoke carefully.
the driver of the other car, you'd no sooner regained consciousness than he...
Oh, he had a fractured skull. The ambulance in turn diagnosed it. Skull fractures often fail to show themselves, then bingo, you keel over. That's what happened. I'll say no more about it.
Of course.
In the hall, the clock struck the quarter hour.
Shall I fix the phenobarbital now?
Yes. No. Is David home?
No, he hasn't gotten back yet.
Has he phoned? He knows he's supposed to be in by midnight at the latest.
No, he hasn't phoned. There's a school dance tonight.
Oh, that's no excuse for not phoning. He's got the old car, doesn't he?
Yes, you gave him the keys this morning, remember?
All the more reason he should phone.
Dr. Williams lay silent a moment.
2 o'clock is too late for a 17-year-old boy to be out.
I'll speak to him. He won't do it again. Please, Mark, let me get you the phenobarbital. I'll stay up till David...
A ringing phone, a clamor in the darkness, interrupted her. Mark Williams reached for it. The extension was beside his bed, after all. Hello, he said. And then, although she couldn't hear the answering voice, she felt him stiffen, and she knew. As well as if she could hear the words, she knew with a mother's instinct for disaster. Yes. Yes. I see. I understand. I'll come at once. Thank you for calling. He slid out of bed before she could stop him. An emergency call. I have to go. He began to throw on his clothes.
It's David, isn't it?
She sat up.
Don't try and keep me from knowing it's David.
Yes, he said, and his voice was very tired. David's hurt. I have to go to him. An accident.
He's dead.
She said it steadily.
David's dead, isn't she, Mark? Isn't he, Mark?
He came over and sat beside her, put his arms around her. Edith, yes, he's dead. 40 minutes ago, the car went over a curve. They have him at the county morgue. They want me to identify him, Edith. You see, the car got fire.
I'm coming with you.
The taxi waited in a pool of darkness between 2 streetlights. The long, low building, which was the county morgue, a blue lamp over its door, stood below the street level. A flight of concrete steps went down into it from the sidewalk. 10 minutes before, Dr. Mark Williams had gone down those steps. Now he climbed back up them, stiffly, wearily, like an old man. Edith was waiting in the taxi, sitting forward on the edge of the seat, hands clenched. As he reached the last step, she opened the door and stepped out.
Mark. Mark. Was it?
Yes, it's David. His voice was a monotone. Son, I've completed the formalities, but now the only thing we can do is go home.
I'm going to him.
She tried to pass, and he caught her wrist. Discreetly, the taxi driver pretended to doze. No, Edith, there's no need. You mustn't see him.
It's my son. Let me go.
No. What have you got under your coat?
It's the bell. The crystal bell. I'm gonna ring it where David can hear.
Defiantly, she brought forth her hand, clutching the little bell.
Brought you back, Mark. Now it's going to bring back David.
Edith, you mustn't believe that's possible. You can't. Those were coincidences. Let me have it.
No, I'm gonna ring it.
Violently, she tried to break out of his grip.
I want David back. I'm going to ring the bell.
She got her hand free. The crystal bell rang in the quiet of the early morning with an eerie thinness penetrating the silence like a silver knife.
There. I've rung it. I know you don't believe, but I do. It'll bring David back.
She raised her voice.
David! David, son, can you hear me?
Edith, you're just tormenting yourself. Come home. Please, come home.
Not till David's come back. David! David, can you hear me?
She rang the bell again, rang it until Dr. Williams seized it, then she let him take it. Edith, Edith, if you've only let me come alone.
Mark, listen.
What?
Listen!
She whispered with a fierce urgency. He was silent, and the fingers of horror drew themselves down his spine at the clear, youthful voice that came up to them from the darkness below.
Mother? Dad? Where are you? David!
Edith Williams breathed.
It's David. Let me go. I must go to him.
No, Edith. Her husband whispered frantically as the voice below called again. Dad? Mother? Are you up there? Wait for me.
Let me go. David, we're here. We're here, son.
Edith, if you ever love me, listen to me. You mustn't go down there, David. I had to identify him by his glass ring and his wallet. He was burnt. Horribly burnt.
I'm going to him.
She wrenched herself free and sped for the steps, up which now was coming a tall form, a shadow, shrouded in the darkness. Dr. Williams, horror knotting his stomach, leaped to stop her, but he slipped and fell headlong on the pavement so that she was able to pant down the stairs to meet the upcoming figure.
Oh, David, David!
She was sobbing. Hey, Mom. The boy held her steady. I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry. I didn't know what had happened until I got home. You weren't there, and then one of the fellows from the fraternity called me. I realized they must have made a mistake. You'd come here. I called for a taxi, came out here. My taxi let me off at the entrance around the block. I've been looking for you down there. Poor Pete. Pete Friedberg. He was driving the old car. I lent him the keys and my driver's license. I shouldn't have, but, well, he's older. He kept begging me.
Then it was Pete who was killed? Pete who was burned?
Yes, Pete. I feel terrible about lending him the car, but he was supposed to be a good driver. Then them calling you and Dad thinking it was me.
And Mark was right. Of course he was right. It's just a bell. A pretty little bell, that's all.
A bell? I don't follow you, Mom.
Oh, never mind. It's just a bell. Hasn't got any powers over life and death. Doesn't bring back, doesn't take away. Let's get back up to your father. He may be thinking the bell really worked.
They climbed the rest of the steps. Dr. Mark Williams still lay where he'd fallen headlong on the pavement. The cab driver was bending over him, but there was nothing to be done. The crystal bell had been beneath him when he fell, and it had broken. One long, fine splinter of crystal was embedded in his heart. I love this one. I love this. I love the initial setup of, ooh, it's a tourist shop. Ooh, it's this guy that knows he's doing tourist things. You know, it hits so clearly the immediate trope beats right up front, that you're like, okay, okay, I know what's happening. This is gonna be a Twilight Zone thing. It's gonna be a will it, won't it? And it, even though you know exactly what's coming as soon as you start reading this, the twists are still so fun. I love them so much. Like that, you could very easily like just cut right where it ended, and then just like have the camera pan slightly to the left, and have like a Rod Serling going, "This was Dr. Mark Williams." You know, I was about to try and improvise like a Rod Serling monologue. I don't know. Uh, this was Dr. Mark Williams. He's always been a big fan of music, but this time his ears heard more than he bargained for in the Twilight Zone. you know? That was not a very good one, and I apologize, but like, it's so Twilight Zone. I love it. I love it so much. Okay, we've done Cask of Amontillado. We've done Ring Once for Death. I believe we had this one planned, unless something else jumps out at me right now. This one's the longer one of the group, and I will be yelling about it on the Twitter before we start it, but I also want to page through my existing short stories first to make sure nothing else suitably spooky jumps out. No, I don't think so. We will eventually get to, provided nobody else reads it, we'll eventually get to the Moon Maid. I've been sitting on that one. That actually, I was going to start that the other week when I didn't quite have the spoons around, but we didn't get started on it. I will get started on it eventually, and we'll eventually get to A Princess of Mars. I've just been waiting for some time to pass. A couple other people in the Codex have done A Princess of Mars, and I don't want to step on any toes. Speaking of Codex, I haven't mentioned them yet. You see this little bug above my head? That guy, that little logo looking thing? That is for a group of reading streamers I'm a part of called Codex, formerly known as the United Storytellers Group. It's essentially just a big Discord full of people who read books like me. You like what I do, you're gonna love the people in the Codex. Each person kind of has their own little genre focus. For example, there's Jubilee OB and Atkinson with some numbers at the end. They play toward the books, modern books with author permission. There's Gariki, who is usually around as a moderator here, who does sort of like Japanese fairy tales and just folk tales at large type thing. Who else is there? I mentioned Atkinson, I mentioned Jubilee. There is something Fox. It starts with a G. Anyway, he's an ASMR guy. He reads just about everything. He reads a much broader swath than the rest of us, rather than kind of the rest of us kind of being a little genre bound. He reads a very broad swath, but he does it in a very ASMR fashion, which unfortunately I can't brook that sort of thing, which is a shame because he's a great reader. I just ASMR makes my skin want to crawl off. And as I've said, it's a real shame because he's actually quite a great streamer. Who else? Who else? There's like one or two other people that they are slipping my mind right now, and it's a shame because they're quite good. Gentle Fox ASMR, by the way, is the one I was couldn't remember half their name. Jev has been doing a lot of because they're in New Zealand, they are beholden to a different set of copyright rules than the rest of us, so they have a very different spread of books on hand. So they lean into that. RNL Quendi, who is probably still lurking when she's not handling cold and wisdom teeth and all that, she kind of leans into content that I'd really love to come back to, that sort of visual novel, otome game, manga type thing, very webtoony. I like it a lot, and I love to tune in when I can. Jeffrey's Webb has been doing Walter's Magic a lot lately. I can't say I know the book very well.
He kind of leans to an adjacent niche as I do. He's been doing a lot of. He did the Scarlet Pimpernel recently, and I'm currently waiting to get the Scarlet Pimpernel into my rotation because it's fun. It's kind of very Zorro-y, very like Masked Vigilante type thing. Is Atkinson still doing hide and seek? It's what made me think of him doing the author permission thing. Anyway, uh, long story short, the Codex is really great. We read a big, wide swath of types of books. If you like what I'm doing, but you don't like the genres I lean on, definitely check out the rest of the Codex. We also have a monthly book club that I just barely missed this time. It was one of the Ender's Game sequels, and they had a very nice, academic discussion on the matter. And I really am miffed every time I miss these monthly book clubs because it's so nice to kind of like have a back and forth of like this scene really stuck out to me versus someone else having a scene that really sticks out to them, and it gets you a bunch of different perspectives on a book. And each time they announce a book, I'm like, oh, I should do that, and then I go get the book from my local library and forget to sign up on the form, and I just every time I want to, but I don't know my schedule that far out unless I am actively driving the RV. So it's harder for me to commit because I don't want to try and show up to this book club after having driven the RV for 8 hours or just completely bereft of spoons. It's usually late in the month. It's very fun. I would heartily suggest tuning in, even if I am not among the member of who's watching. I like them a lot. I like them. I like the academic discussion. It's very satisfying. Have we discussed what book we're picking next? Let me check here. No, they're still talking about the last messages in the chat over there are about still about the Ender's Game sequel that I completely I'm a little miffed I missed out on because I've read Ender's Game and it's a good book, and I was like, oh well, I wonder if the sequels are good, but I didn't. No. Anyway, that's the Codex in a very large nutshell. Pan over and there's like the world's largest walnut. It's the size of my head. But very, very small nutshell. The Codex is a group of reading streamers, just like the chatbot said. There's a Discord. I'd heartily suggest joining it. If you don't want to join my own Discord, which, by the way, did you know I have a Discord? It's a real thing. I have a Discord. There's a link for it. I forget I have a Discord, to be honest with you. I've been trying to produce some more Discord-only content, so if you're really interested in some of the things I do off-camera, I'm kind of airing those on the Discord a little bit. I'm going to be doing some editing streams, Discord-only, pretty soon here. Just kind of to give you all a glimpse into the process. I might throw on the camera while I'm baking bread or something for a Discord stream. I want to spend a lot more time just kind of hanging out in the Discord and being like, this is things. It's not necessarily a members only thing. You can come just by clicking on the link, but I want to have more of this sort of Discord exclusive content. Make it a little more worth it for showing up, instead of just being one more chat to say hello in and like 4 other people say hello and that's it. I've found a lot of streamer Discords turn into that where it's just like, I have this, here's my thing, and people, it's very slow and very quiet. I want there to be a reason for you to come to the Discord. So I'm kind of trying to lean into that. What else while I'm plugging things? Oh, this is a podcast, if you didn't know that. Which is going to sound very silly if you, which is going to sound very silly if you're listening to this through the podcast feed. By the way, if you're listening to this for the podcast feed, did you know you can rate podcasts on Spotify? I didn't know that. I thought it was an iTunes only thing. You know how it's like, oh yeah, if you're listening through iTunes, rate it 5 stars. You can give podcast star ratings through Spotify. Like it's in the little drop-down menus somewhere. I figured that out the other day. I was like, I heard somebody plugged oh yeah, rate this podcast because we want to do good, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But what if I'm on Spotify and I poked around and you can do star ratings on Spotify? So if you wanna go do that, go ahead. Feel free to leave me a rating. Feel free to leave me a review. I very occasionally poke my head into the iTunes reviews. I need to do that again, actually. It's been a while. And I love reading your feedback. I love seeing the sort of audience I've cultivated. And really, outside of the podcast reviews, if you're on the podcast feed, the Discord's probably the best place to come over and shout at me like, hey, you're doing things, it's good, or hey, you're doing things, it's bad. Unless you want to roll up to me in the YouTube comments. That's about it. I have an email. You want to email me things? Email me things. Uh, oh, there is a YouTube. If you're interested in the video half of the podcast that gets chopped out for the podcast feeds, it exists. It's on YouTube. The YouTube version is actually the unabridged cut. I abridge a great deal of stuff out of the podcast feed, mostly just cat problems. But if you want to hear Librarian Magnus being little gerblins, go check it out on YouTube. Or if you just want the full unabridged cut. Anyway, I think I've plugged enough of my various internet things. Probably. Um, let's get into what I assume is our last book for the night, based on how long it is. We'll see, though. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. A real Halloween classic, this one. Uh, Shocking absolutely no one. We're going to be picking this one up. I must admit, I was very tempted to pick up Frankenstein. We started this season of paper cuts with The Last Man, and so that makes Frankenstein very tempting. But we'll get to Frankenstein eventually, I promise. I don't really have much experience with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It was one of the few books for English class that really didn't bite me from the Halloween, the traditional Halloween set of public domain stuff. Uh, yeah, the Sleepy Hollow is one of the few that really just didn't get a hold of me. I was just like, all right, cool, it's a thing, and like, it's really fun in concept, but it just didn't bite me at the time. Which probably means that I'm going to love the heck out of it now, because that's usually what happens to me with these English class books. Is I'm like, ooh, I don't know, it's okay, but it's not that good. And I go back to it as an older adult, and I'm like, oh, this actually slapped. I was just having a bad day. you know. So, actually, what time is it? It's about that time. Nah. Hmm. I'm gonna tell Twitter. Actually, that's what I meant to do before I got distracted. Twitter exists. I do have a Twitter, believe it or not. I've been yelling about random weird stuff on the internet for a long time. The book teased here. I'm not hearing ringworms for death, though. If I can type. Anyway. Local man easily distracted, shocking absolutely no one. Let us let's begin The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, found among the papers of the late Deirdre Knickerbocker, a
pleasing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of gay castles in the clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer sky, the castle of indolence. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, which by some is called Greensboro, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we're told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, let's do that again. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land, among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just murmur enough to lull one to repose. The occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon that uniform tranquillity. I recollect that, when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of that valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around me, and it prolonged, reverberated by an angry echo. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions, and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place, and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others say that it was an old Indian chief, a prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some sort of witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs. They are subject to trances and visions, frequently see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abound with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. Nightmare in this context is not, a nightmare dream you're having, but the literal cryptid. I'm gonna call it a cryptid. Cryptid the nightmare. It's like a flaming horse. It has 9 flaming horses behind it. It's supposed to be kind of an apocalyptic omen. It's never good luck, I'll tell you that much. Kind of mane of flames, eyes of a stellar glow. Very scary stuff. Anyway, the dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enclosed region, the dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It's said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper. Nightmare, what you beeping down there for? Yeah, I'm talking about you. You have things to say to the internet. You gotta come up here and say them. They can't hear you down there. Yeah, we're talking about you. Yeah, come up here. Come on up here. Say hi. Can't just say words and not come up here. Huh? Come here. Be a lap lab. Indulge me. Indulge me and be a lap lad, please. Anyway, oh yeah, it is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning this spectre, allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in its nightly quest for its head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered the sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Sorry, something just made a noise that I am very concerned about, and then library meowed, so I'm like, ugh. The rest of the world is feeling the horror as we are, apparently. What's the problem, kitty? Do I need to look under the couch? He's cleaning. I'm taking that as a no. Mimic Harbor, that's where we were, I think. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this by-place of nature there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet which might have served for shovels, and his whole frame was most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at the top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. Bless you, Magnus. He's sneezing at all the hay dust this man's blowing off like a big old scarecrow. Huh. Oh. Whatever dust he was sneezing at just got into my nose, too. That's fun. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours, by a withe twisted in the handle of the door, and stakes set against the window shutters so that a thief might get in with perfect ease, and he might find some embarrassment in getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by the architect, Joost van Houten, from the mystery of an eel pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, in the tone of menace or command, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch, as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny stripling was winced at the least flourish of the rod, was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough, wrong-headed, broad-skirted Dutch urchin, who skulked and swelled and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance, so consolatory to the smarting urchin, that he would remember it and thank him for the longest day he had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys. On holiday afternoons, he would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small. It would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom, in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successively, a week at a time, thus going rounds of the neighborhood, with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be too onerous on the purses of his rustic patrons, who were apt to consider the costs of schooling a grievous burden, and schoolmasters as mere drones, he had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped to make hay, mended the fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from the pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. A couple of those I would not describe as lighter labors. Pitching hay is... Maybe this is just like a modern thing with pitching, big hay bales. Loading hay is hard. I say as someone who's only really arranged bales in a barn and not actually had to load hay actively. Maybe it was a little easier when you didn't have these, mechanical compacted bales. I don't know. Mending fences is more an exercise in tedium than anything. But it's still, usually, of course, the fences decide to show their holes and break during the hottest time of the year, and so then you're sitting there trying in vain to get these fence staples around the wire and into the pole correctly. And of course, I have the aim of someone who can't hit the broadside of a barn, so I'm sitting here with this fence staple swinging and swinging and swinging, and I don't hit 4 times out of 5, and the 5th one just barely gets the thing to start sinking in, and then I'm like, all right, okay, it's holding itself. Bunk, 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 bunk. Finally get it in there. Because, I'm giving it enough of a swing to get the fence staple in there, but I'm still missing 4 swings out of 5, so I'm exhausted, a third of the way into the fence, while everyone else who can actually hit the broadside of a barn has taken off and has half the fence done already. And cutting wood for the winter fire was the other one that stood out to me. I'm like, that's not light labor. That's a lot of work. Like maybe at this point in time, it was a little easier to split wood. The skill with an axe is a much more common thing to have at that time. But for someone as unskilled with me, as I've previously stated, can't hit the broadside of a barn. Splitting wood's kind of a pain. I mean, if you give it the little bitty tap and you set the axe where you want to be in the log, and then you swing the whole affair, it's not so bad. But it's definitely still enough to make you lose a few layers in midwinter. You know what I mean? Anyway, I've digressed. Where was I? Cutting wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway with which he lorded it in his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and like the lion bold, with whom so magnanimously the lamb did hold, he would sit with a child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours together. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. Psalmody? 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 One of those is correct. Psalmody. We're going to say psalmody because they're psalms. Anyway, it was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers, where in his own mind he completely carried away the palm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above the rest of the congregation, and there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, which may even be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill pond on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by divers little makeshifts, in that ingenious way which is commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought, by all who understood nothing of the labour of head work, to have a wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighbourhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea-table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cake or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in the churchyard between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. Sorry, I'm gonna wander off the plot again here. You know what I haven't had in many, many years? A clutch of wild grapes. Like, I know, we're used to these modern table grapes that have no seeds, and they've been, domesticated, so they're this big, they're a good-sized grape. But the thing with a wild grape is it much like any other, thing that you're growing yourself, it hasn't been domesticated quite so hard, so it's much smaller and it's much more concentrated in its flavor. And especially with these wild grapes, the stand of wild grapes I'm thinking of is a good long way from me and out of season by this point. But they're mostly seed. You kind of you take them into your mouth and you bite them, and immediately almost your tooth sinks into the seed. But the little burst of concentrated grape juice that fills your mouth is so lovely. And I do treasure the memory very much. So reading about, oh yes, he grabs the wild grapes from around the trees. I'm like, oh, I remember. While we're talking about wild fruit that's really good, and I'm shocked hasn't had any kind of effort to become more of like a grocery store staple, are mulberries. I get it. Most people consider a mulberry kind of a weed plant, you know. It's not something you want around because the birds eat it and then they stain things purple, and it's a huge problem for some people. But personally, I think if you get a mulberry tree placed correctly so it's not quite so much of a nuisance because of the birds, they're a wonderful, wonderful fruit. Additional fun fact, there is a variety of mulberry tree that is native to where I am right now, but most of the mulberry trees in the United States are actually imported from, I believe, China in an attempt to kickstart a local silkworm, a local silk farming business, and essentially, because these birds would eat these mulberries and fly off into the world and spread the seeds as birds do very effectively with mulberries, might I add. They're everywhere. And they're very tasty, and I love when they're in season. And they're also very, very small, so, it's not worth trying to climb a tree with a bucket in hand. You have to spread a tarp around the bottom of the tree and stir and shake branches. Sorry, I tangent. I promise that one was kind of on topic, though. Long story short, maybe think about introducing some fruits into your neighborhood. Even like having like a small apple tree yourself. These varieties that don't ship well. You know, just a thought. Perhaps consider. Then you could tell all your neighbors, "Hey, come take all these 5 billion pounds of apples off of me, so I can not have a yard full of apples." And then all your neighbors get apples, and you get some apple butter back, and it's great. Anyway, the book we're reading, remember that? From his half itinerant life, also, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he was most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales, until gathering dusk of evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The groan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree-toad, that harbinger of storm, the deadly hooting of the screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path. And if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor valet was ready to give up the ghost, with the idea that he was struck with a witch's token. His only resource on such occasions, either to drown thought or drive away evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes, and the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody in linked sweetness long drawn out, floating from the distant hill or along the dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listened to their marvelous tales of ghosts, goblins, haunted fields, haunted brooks, haunted bridges, haunted houses, particularly of the haunt of the headed horseman, or galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft and of the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air, which prevailed in earlier times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn round. They were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there was a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, where of course no spectre dared to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path, amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night! With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window! How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path! How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder lest he should behold some uncouth being tramping close behind him! And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling among the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings! All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness, and though he had seen many spectres in his time, and had been more than once beset by Satan in divers shapes in his lonely perambulations, yet daylight put an end to all this evil, and he would have passed a peasant life of it, in spite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal men than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was, of course, a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting, and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty but her vast expectations. She was withal a little of a coquette, as might be perceived in her even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Sardam, the tempting stomacher of the olden time, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the county round. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards that sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favour in his own eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it's true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and piqued himself upon the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. Excuse me. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water in a little well formed of a barrel, then stole sparkling away through the grass to a neighbouring brook that babbled along amongst alders and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn that might have served for a church, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. The flail was busily resounding within it from morning to night. Swallows and martins skimmed, twittering about the eaves. Rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up as if watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about their dames, were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in repose and abundance of their pens, from whence sallied forth, now and then, troops of suckling pigs, as if to sniff the air. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, conveying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling through the farmyard, and guinea fowls fretting about it like ill-tempered housewives, with their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door strutted the gallant cock, that pattern of a husband, a warrior, and a fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings, and crowing in the pride and gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, then generously calling his ever-hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel which he discovered. The pedagog's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of a luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. Pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cosily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. In the porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham, not a turkey but he beheld daintily trussed, with a gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savoury sausages. And even bright Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his back in a side dish with uplifted claws, as if craving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. That's some fantasy novel food if I've ever heard it. You know what I mean by fantasy novel food? You know, this that sense of food that is just almost described in such a way to be incredibly extra alluring. The best analogy I have is the way Ghibli films draw food. That, but described in words. Also, apparently pigeons are supposed to be like a really good red meat. I'm kind of skittish about it. You might be able to get me to eat a pigeon in like a stew or something, but I don't think I could eat a pigeon outright. I don't know, but they're supposed to be like very. They're supposed to be good like food. There are tales of people in late modernity, post World War II, just occasionally just grabbing a pigeon at the park and just roasting it for dinner, which is wild to me. Did you know pigeons are not like they're a domesticated species? There's you see all these wild and crazy colorful pigeons because they're domesticated. They're feral domestics. It used to be a hobby of the rich and famous to breed these pigeons in these pigeonholes. And I think that's very interesting. You see that here, and it's like you never think of that in a modern context. Anyway, as usual, getting distracted. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat, and Indian corn, the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes, and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children mounted on top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, pots and kettles dangling beneath. He beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare, with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high ridged but low sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers. The low projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Benches were built along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the centre of the mansion, and the place of usual residence. Here rows of resplendent pewter, arranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey-woolsey, just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn, strings of dried apples and peaches, hung in gay festoons along the wall, mingled with the gourd of red peppers. A door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlour, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors, and irons, with their accompanying shovel and tongs, glistened from their covert of asparagus tops. Mock oranges, conch shells, they decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to a lot of knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with, had to make his way merely through the gates of iron and brass, and the walls of adamant, to the castle keep, where the lady of his heart was confined, all which he achieved as easily as a man would carve his way to the centre of a Christmas pie. Then the lady gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments, and he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Brunt, the hero of the country road, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood, of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered, double-jointed, with a short, curly black hair, and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had earned the nickname of Brom Bones, for which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and with the ascendancy which bodily strength always acquires in a rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side, and giving his decisions with an air and tone that admitted no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humour at bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles round. In cold weather he was distinguished by a fur cap, surmounted with a flaunting fox's tail, and when the folks at a country gathering described descried rather, I was like, described? That doesn't look right. At a country gathering described this well-known crest at a distance, whisking about among a squad of hard riders, they always stood by for a squall. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight, with whoop and halloo like a troop of Don Cossacks, and the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry-scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim, "Ah, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, they always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no inclination to cross a lion in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that the master was courting, or as it's termed, sparkling within, all other suitors passed by in despair, and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supplejack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, the moment it was away, jerk, he was erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours, any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Walt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better even than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had to do enough to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things, and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about at the house, or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Bolt would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior who, armed with a sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind on the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to lovers' eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me they've always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, while others have 1,000 avenues, and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but a still greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter, for man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones, and from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interest of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain to have carried matters to open warfare, and settled their pretensions to the lady, according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat, but Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up, and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the subject of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night in spite of its formidable fastenings of withen window stakes, turned everything topsy-turvy, so the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in presence of his mistress, had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in a pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool from whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed a ferule, that sceptre of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evil-doers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons, detected upon the persons of the idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them, with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was sudden. Heads up. This was published at a time that this word's fine. Sorry, I'm reading it. Them's the rules. You were warned. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a Negro in toe cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of halter. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry-making or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's, and having delivered his message with the air of importance, an effort at fine language with a negro is apt to display on petty embassies of the kind, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of importance and hurry of his mission. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves, inkstands were overturned, benches turned down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black, arranging his locks by a bit of broken looking-glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciled, a choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans von Ripper, and thus, gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet I should, in the true spirit of the romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipments of the hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough-horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged with a ewe-neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had a gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favourite steed of the master's, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider, and had infused, very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal, for old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in its hand like a sceptre, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans von Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. Forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail sat at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their revelry they fluttered, chirping and frolicking from bush to bush, and tree to tree, capricious from the very profusion and variety around them. There was the honest cock-robin, the favourite game of a stripling sportsman, with its loud, querulous note, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds, and the golden-winged woodpecker with his crimson crest, his broad black gorget, and splendid plumage, and the cedar bird with its red-tipped wings and yellow-tipped tail, and its little Montiero cap of feathers, and the blue jay, that noisy coxcomb, in his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, nodding, bobbing and bowing,
pretending to be on good terms with every songster of the grove. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered, garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. Thus, feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which look out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled its broad disk down in the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy, excepting that here and there a gentle undulation waved and prolonged the blue shadow of the distant mountain. A few amber clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into a pure apple green, and from that into a deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipices that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. A sloop was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast, and as was the reflection of the sky gleaming along the still water, it seemed that the vessel was suspended in the air. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of the Heer Van Tassel, which he found thronged with pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a rare leathern-faced race, in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats with scissors and pin-cushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom lasses, almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. The sons in short, square-knitted coats, with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally queued in the fashion of the time, especially if they could procure an eel skin for the purpose, it being esteemed throughout the country as a potent nourisher and strengthener of the hair. Sorry, I just noticed something. Yeah, the thing. Sorry, I noticed something off screen. Apologies. Where was I? Eel? Yes. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature, much like himself, full of mettle and mischief, which no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks, which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held a tractable, well-broken horse as unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain I would pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses, with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea-table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped-up platters of cakes and various almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughy donut, the tender oily cake, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes, short cakes, ginger cakes, honey cakes, the whole family of cakes. Oh man, I would love a donut or an oily cake right now. I have a wonderful family recipe for potato donuts that I've been direly tempted to do, to take a shot at recently. I also just have like a Krispy Kreme copycat recipe lying around that I want to give a shot. Because, shocker, I'm too lazy to go buy yeast, so I just use my sourdough starter for everything. Which I don't think that might. I think that might not work very well for the potato donuts, the family recipe, but it will work for these Krispy Kremes because I've done it before. Shh, don't tell anybody. That was a secret. But I'm thinking about doing kind of a donut in the style of an oily cake. You know, no hole in the middle, and it's filled with apple butter because I have a good abundance of apple butter around. Just because I forgot to bring them with me, I was supposed to bring them with me while I was out bouncing around last to give to gifts to people who were being nice to me, but I forgot to grab those, so nobody got apple butter, sad face. Uh, but anyway, I want to do some filled donuts with apple butter because I'm curious if the texture will work. Because apple butter is kind of like a little more textural than the average thing you'd find in a potato donut. Haven't heard those words in 10 years. Oh, I I don't know if potato donuts are like a thing locally where I'm from, or if they're just a thing from my family because my family's very Irish. But either way, uh, we I don't know that we've done it in a while, but it used to be when we would all get together for Christmas. Uh, there would be earlier in the day, you know, several people would descend on the kitchen and make potato donuts, and oh, they're divine. They're so good. You probably can't make them in the same way you used to anymore. They've changed the formulation on Crisco several times, and so that changes some volume of it, but they're just so good. And I know, like, some people are like, ew, it is mashed potato. Ooh. I'm like, yeah, but it's good, though. you know? Oh, I could wax poetic about sweets probably longer than this whole page would go on, but let's get back to the description they have here. Uh, and then there were apple pies and peach pies, pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef. Moreover, delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I've enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor. Excuse me, its clouds of vapor from the midst. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty. Oh man, there was something else that stuck out in here that I was like, ooh, I haven't had one of those in a long time. A quince. I haven't had a quince in a good long while. You think they preserve persimmons? I had a fresh persimmon last year when it was persimmon season, and they're quite good. But I don't know if they preserve very well. Can you make like a persimmon jelly or a persimmon jam? I would think so, but that's just a guess. I'm also very much not in persimmon country while it's persimmon season this year. But last year I was, and I was like, oh, persimmons, they're in season, give. Anyway, this book's making me hungry, man. I may have to eat something after I'm done here. Anyway, he was a kind and thankful creature, whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. Don't I know the feeling? He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. And then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans Van Ripper and, and, and every other niggardly patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of doors that should dare to call him comrade. Ugh. This book has like, listen, I know that that word means kind of like stingy or like jealous, but I'm like, internally, I'm like, but it's fine. It's on the page. It's allowed. As is the rule. Anyway, old Baltus Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief but expressive.
being confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of the music from the common room or hall summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed Negro who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of his head, bowing almost to the ground and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple were to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fibre about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, the blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the admiration of all the negroes who, having gathered of all ages and sizes from the farm and neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling their eyeballs, and showing grinning rows of ivory from ear to ear. How could the flogger of the urchins be otherwise than animated than joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod, who was attracted to a knot of these Sager folks, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times, drawing out long stories about the war. When this book's set, that would be like the Revolutionary War, right? Because they have the Headless Horseman's ghost, who is, well, I guess the Civil War would be more appropriate. When's this book set? 1800s? I digress. The neighborhood, at the time of which I'm speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had been run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees, cowboys, all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and in the indistinctness of this recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. Well, so the war's not long before, but enough for big fish. There was the story of Dofue Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. There was an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich a mynheer to be lightly mentioned, who, in the battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defence, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade. My house is making concerning noises this evening. I'm not even doing Telltale Heart. That would have been perfect if my house decided to make all these noises. Where was I? Parrying a musket ball with a small sword? Yes. That he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade and glance off at the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But these were all nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded them. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of that kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they've scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they've no acquaintances left to call upon. This is, perhaps, the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in these long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. Excuse me. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and as usual were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains, mourning cries, wailings heard and seen around the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite spectre of Sleepy Hollow, the headless horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country. It was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent whitewashed walls shine modestly forth like Christian purity beaming does not have an L, like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which peeps might be caught at the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there at least the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brewer, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he had met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, was obliged to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, till they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brewer into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper. That he'd offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow, but just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales told in that drowsy undertone which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter, mingling with the clatter of hoofs, echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter till they gradually died away. And the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth, after no great interval, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had often gloated, he went straight to the stable, with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats, and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards, along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him, the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop, riding quietly at anchor underneath the land. In the dead hush of midnight he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from this faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened, would sound far, far off, from some farmhouse away among the hills, but it was like a dreaming sound in his ear. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he'd heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant over all the other trees of the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for an ordinary tree, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partially out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partially from the tales of the strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. Sorry, I have like one little fly that's been flying in front of my face all night. So if you've been seeing me meow, 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 it's because I'm trying to catch that fly and it's not working. Anyway, as Ichabod approached the fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood lay bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at the identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines, with a sturdy yeoman concealed who surprised him. This has been ever since considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with his contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it's true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starving ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge with a suddenness that nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveller. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping a ghost or a goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who, who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice, but still there was no answer. Once more he cuddled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, and, shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself into motion, with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to his equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind, and the other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he couldn't utter a stave. One moment, I need to drink some water so my parched tongue doesn't clove to the roof of my mouth. Oh, don't you love when you just... Excuse me. Don't you love when you just drink wrong? There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pernicious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveller in relief against the sky, was gigantic in height, and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror still was more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments tattered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping it up, made an opposite turn, and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow, shaded by trees, for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in goblin story, and just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet the panic of the steed had given his unskilful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had gotten halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping Gunpowder around the neck when the saddle fell to the earth. He heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath crossed across his mind, but it was for that was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and unskilful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes to the other, sometimes jolted on the high ridge of the horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom's Bones' ghostly competitors had disappeared. "If I can but reach that bridge," thought Ichabod, "I'm safe." Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him, even fancied he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, the goblin rider, they all passed like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, and still no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some unease about the fate of poor Ichabod, and his saddle for that matter. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog's ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which the last was a sheet of foolscap much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor to the heiress of Van Tassel. These magic books and poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans Van Ripper, who, from that time forward, determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good come of the same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, he had received his quarter's pay just a day or 2 before, must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brewer, Bones, and a whole budget of others were called to mind. When they diligently considered them all, compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads, came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in its stead. It's true, an old farmer, who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, he brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive. He left that neighborhood, partly through fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, partly in notification at having been suddenly dismissed, or mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress. That he'd changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school, studied law at the same time, been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who were the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. It's a favorite story often told around the neighborhood about the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay, and was reported rather to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue and the ploughboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm, true, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Postscript, found in the handwriting of Mr. Knickerbocker. The preceding tale is given almost in the precise words in which I heard it related at a corporation meeting at the ancient city of Manhattan, at which were present many of its sagest and most illustrious burghers. The narrator was a pleasant, shabby, gentlemanly old fellow in pepper and salt clothes, with a sadly humorous face, and one whom I strongly suspected of being poor. He made such efforts to be entertaining, after all. When his story was concluded, there was much laughter and approbation, particularly from 2 or 3 of the deputy aldermen, who had been asleep the greater part of the time. There was, however, one tall, dry-looking old gentleman, with beetling eyebrows, who maintained a grave and rather severe face throughout, now and then folding his arms, inclining his head, and looking down upon the floor as if turning a doubt over in his mind. He was one of your wary men who never laugh but upon good grounds, when they've got reason and law on their side. When the mirth of the rest of the company had subsided, and silence had been restored, he leaned one arm on the elbow of his chair, and sticking the other akimbo, demanded, with a slight but exceedingly stage motion of the head and contraction of the brow, what was the moral of the story? What did it want to prove? The storyteller, who was just putting a glass of wine to his lips as a refreshment after his toils, paused for a moment, looked at his inquirer with an air of infinite deference, and, lowering the glass slowly to the table, observed that the story was intended most logically to prove that there's no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided we will but take a joke as we find it. That therefore he that runs races with goblin troopers is likely to have rough riding of it. Ergo, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step to high preferment in the state. The cautious old gentleman knit his brows tenfold closer after this explanation, being sorely puzzled by the ratio inclination of the syllogism, while, methought, the one in pepper and salt eyed him with something of a triumphant leer. At length he observed that all this was very well, but he still thought the story a little on the extravagant side. There were 1 or 2 points on which he had his doubts. Faith, sir, as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself. D.K. The end. D.K. is in David Knickerbocker, I assume. Alright. Well, that wasn't bad. I did, in fact, like it a lot better than the last time I read Sleepy Hollow. Not bad at all. Definitely feels like something I would try to write. Very light on dialogue because my dialogue's not the strongest. How much time have we got here? We're at about 2:30. Time wise. Tell you what, I'm gonna call it a little early. Mostly because I thought that several of these. I thought that the first 2 stories were going to take me a little longer than they did. I got into a very good clip with those 2, so I took a little less time than I thought, and I think we're not remiss in having a shorter episode to go with these shorter stories. So once again, I implore you, if you're a podcast listener, feel free to give me a rating. I like to have that sort of community interaction, and if you don't want to give me a rating, go ahead, drop by the Discord. It's in the show notes every week. And another thing that's in the show notes every week is the book we're reading. Every time we have a new book on the show, I put the Gutenberg link in the podcast show notes. I know not a lot of people check the show notes, but there is some stuff that I think you will find quite pleasant in the show notes. If you wanted to read along with us, the Gutenberg link is always there as a form of transcript. Sure, it doesn't quite transcribe my wandering off from the story, but really, that's not the important part, is it? Anyway, this has been Paper Cuts, and I